This event is part of the Being Human Festival, and that's taking place across the UK between the 9th and the 18th of November. And the Being Human Festival, if you don't know, is the UK's national festival of the humanities. And it's run by the School of Advanced Study, the University of London, with generous support from Research England in partnership with the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the British Academy. So if you'd like to find out more about the festival, you have a couple more days to enjoy it. You can go to their website, beinghumanfestival.org, or at social media, their hashtag is beinghuman2023, and they are also at beinghumanfest. So the evaluation is important for them because it enables us to keep these events free. So please, some of you at least, fill in the Being Human Festival evaluation, and that will help keep it improving and keep it free. And the feedback is very valuable indeed for us. So let me introduce the evening tonight. My name is Nadia Valman. I'm Professor of Urban Literature at Queen Mary University of London, which is just next door to the Archive in Bancroft Road. And the exhibition that we'll be exploring and discussing tonight, Everything is Different, Nothing Has Changed, was inspired by two collections of oral history recordings that are held here at Tower Hamlets Local History Library and Archives. They existed on cassette tapes, which were digitized as part of a research project on the East End over the last century and a half, which was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. So I'd just like to begin by expressing my thanks to the Arts and Humanities Research Council for making these sources available, usable, accessible to the general public as well as researchers. And also for making possible these kinds of new collaborations between academics, archives, and artists, which is an enormous privilege for all of us to have been able to work together. And we very much hope it will inspire other projects of this kind. It's relatively unusual for artists to make work using oral history recordings. More often, it's historians who use them because of the unique insights that oral history gives us into everyday life. And there's something especially intimate about oral history as a resource, hearing the human voice close to your ear, a warm exchange with a sympathetic interviewer, thoughts unfolding as memories start to flow, or words stop, are interrupted, or repeated. And this is one of the things we hear in these audio works. But there's more too. Alistair, Emily, and Sima also play around with sound, bringing together voices that time has held apart, or re-speaking old words in new voices. And their work suggests connections among different moments in the past and between the past and the present. And in particular, you'll notice in the work, there's a particular interest in two moments in East End history, two very significant moments, the 1936 Battle of Cable Street and the 1978 murder of Altab Ali, which are used by all of the artists in really interestingly different ways. So in many of the recordings that these artists have drawn on, we have that sense of the intimate first-person voice speaking to us, speaking perhaps words that haven't been spoken before. But also the speaker remembers collective voices, the playground, the street, voices raised in anger at protests or lowered in solidarity at memorial events. And as I've listened to the installation over the past few weeks, these have seemed all the more resonant, as we too in the present are living in another moment of solidarity and public protest. And the streets of our borough are again alive with the sounds of voices raised together, or silent with the sounds of collective mourning or reflection. So in conceiving this exhibition right at the beginning, what I was really interested in was how artists might listen to the past similarly or differently from historians. As artists with very different kinds of creative practice, they've also, of course, listened differently from each other. So that's what we're going to explore tonight in a discussion with all three artists who've contributed to this installation. And we're really interested too in your responses and your thoughts and your questions. So we'll have some time for that after we hear from each of the artists separately, interviewed or in conversation with a different person who I will be introducing. And then there'll be a little bit of discussion among the panelists and the artists, and then we'll open up the floor for your questions and your thoughts. I first want to turn to my left to welcome Emily Peasgood and Alan Dein. Emily Peasgood is a sound artist and composer creating installations and sculptures. Her award-winning work creates connections with people and places at risk of being forgotten or ignored. And she's exhibited widely in graveyards, public lifts, and tunnels. She received her PhD in creating accessible musical artworks in the community, and she's a professor of sonic art at Guildhall School of Music and Drama. And her piece for this exhibition, When We Were Young, creates a soundscape evoking childhood in East London's Jewish community in the 1930s. Emily will be in conversation with Alan Dein. Alan is an award-winning radio documentary journalist who's worked for BBC Radio 4 since the 1990s, and he's also an oral historian who recorded some of the first oral history interviews with elderly Jewish immigrants and has a long and deep relationship with Tower Hamlets Archive. Thank you, Emily and Alan.
Thank you, Nadia. Firstly, it's really great to see the crowd here tonight, and I hope you really enjoy the session. And I just want to start off by saying that I had the pleasure to meet with Alistair, Emily and Sima some months ago as they were sort of beginning their journey into this project. And it's been fascinating to see what they've come up with, having had those early conversations about what they were trying to get at, and particularly get at using sound. And my life has been in sound, as Nadia said. I've been an oral historian since the 1980s and have worked in radio pretty much all my life. So, sound has a great significance and meaning to me, and it's always a pleasure to know that people are working in sound in so many different kinds of ways. And obviously Emily's project is intriguing because, of course, it's the way that you kind of can connect archive with your own kind of vision and also bringing in accompanying new material. And I suppose really how I'd like to start with you, Emily, is really just to get a sense of, just briefly, your sort of own background. What attracted you to working in sound?
I don't know. All I can say is that I'm really fascinated in what sound can tell us about the world, in a world that feels like it privileges the edges and the definitiveness of visual materials. And I suppose in my work as a sound artist, I'm interested in sonic research. I think there's something about sound and music that's really ephemeral and borderless, and it's a lot more subjective. I mean, all of us working with sound probably feel the same way. And that excites me. And so I like to research sound and listen to sonic archives, which I feel are not generally privileged in the same way as books.
And significantly, you're working with an archive. And of course, this exhibition is about sound, but it's also about how you accompany it with a visual stimulus for the listener. Yeah. So it's about sound and something else. But just about the archive, working with an archive, obviously, as Tamsin was describing, this incredible depth of Tower Hamlets Archive and the sound here. How did you begin? Did you have a vision in your mind of what you were looking for? Or did you just want to kind of sample the sounds, get a feel of the material?
I didn't really know, aside from the fact that I didn't want to divorce the sound from its context. So I didn't want to treat it as a material I could play with in that way. It felt disrespectful, I think. But I did listen to them all quite a lot and just wait to see what came to me. And what fascinated me was all these recordings of people talking about really quite horrific things, but with such fondness. And it reminded me of when women give birth. If we remembered how horrible that was, we certainly wouldn't do it again. And I think perhaps we're biologically programmed to forget traumatic events. But it fascinates me how we recount things that were really quite traumatic through rose-tinted glasses.
And of course, the title is When We Were Young. And often a lot of our historians do begin by asking people about their memories of childhood. Yeah. And that was something that it sounded like you wanted to access. You wanted to kind of listen to those specific memories of childhood and growing up in a place.
Yeah, I listened to parts of different recordings and I imagined I could hear those people as young people. It felt like they were interchangeable. Like I could hear there's a recording of Alfred Marx talking about people throwing rotten apples at him, which is so mean. And I could just hear a young person saying it. And I got the idea to work with local children in Tower Hamlets to have them reenact certain scenes from the archives. So you can be hearing the original interviewee, and suddenly it goes into the voice of the young person, like their young self, before it moves back again.
I remember the way it smelled mostly, because we lived next to a factory and like the hops. You could always smell the hops. And along Brady Street there was a great big baker shop, at night mostly. You could always smell the fresh bread being baked. And Friday, the smell of chicken soup. It was always smells,
It always smells.
Because
Colour-wise, it's grey and black and dirty, but the smells are great. There are different smells on Friday to Monday, You walk down the street and smell the chicken soup being made and the flowers. You can always smell those on Friday because everybody on their way home from work buys a bunch to take home for Shabbos.
And that's a sort of performance element because you've got the original archive, the audio, which you were sampling, you were also listening to, and also you were trying to, I presume, create a narrative with that, a sort of sense of how these individual bits of recordings were going to fit together.
Yeah, I think of it a bit like a long-form composition. There are loose themes that connect, but it's quite flowing and deliberately it's a quite long piece, so you can wander in and hear it in different ways every time you go into the space. Yeah.
Briefly, I don't know how many people have actually heard the piece, but it's fascinating because there's bits of, kind of classic things like childhood games, but also there's other things. There's street battles and there's a sense of the kind of coarser element of life in the East End, particularly back in those days. So it's not just rose-tinted spectacles, is it? It's sort of people reminiscing, both because they're fondly remembering their childhood, but their childhood is not sometimes easy to recall because it's not always a pleasant one.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by the way we look back and the naivety of children and the way they describe things and the parallels with the topics that we were researching. I thought it was really interesting.
And what you've done is amazing because I actually listened to some of the audio, which was something that I had recorded 30 years ago when I was a lot younger. So that was kind of strange in itself. But what was so interesting is that you've got these voices and you've got these children's games and you've got songs, of course. Music is very important as well, and how children listen to music. But of course, I can't not talk about the accompanying visual element. Can you describe that? What is it? Tell me what you wanted to do with that piece.
I wanted to remember loads of lines of laundry when I was a kid and how they felt absolutely enormous. And I can't honestly give you a cohesive explanation for why there's lines of laundry and recordings of adults going into children. It just felt right. I remembered so vividly being a kid and just feeling like they were everywhere and they were massive. And it's not something we see so much anymore. I did see a lot of pictures in archives as well of laundry lines, which I thought was really fascinating. Yeah.
And the photographs of the laundry actually really work well as well, visually.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by it. And I found out that Mother Goose apparently is buried in Whitechapel, like the real Mother Goose, which I thought was really fascinating, and made a bit of an effort to sort of create a scene almost. Yeah. So there's stuff that's referred to. So there's the number 15 bus. There's a gramophone that you can use and it plays a Rita Marlowe song. She was an East End singer.
Yeah, sung in Yiddish.
Yeah, and Mother Goose for Jewish children, which I thought was really interesting, to source all of that stuff and create just something that I felt took me back a bit and hopefully might take other people back.
And what's interesting about the children's voices that are contemporary voices that you've recorded is that sometimes they riff on what people are saying and it's kind of very playful. It's like what kids would do. Sometimes they actually imitate and sometimes they sort of sample it and riff it and sort of wrap around with those voices.
We had them in here actually. It was so funny. We created a den out of these blue screens and put quilts over the top, and then they had to go in and they were having the time of their lives. They were reenacting this scene where somebody that was in a wine shop was recounting when they were a child. They went on the roof with their friends with all the corks and lobbed them at people in the street. And so I got the children to do this. And they were brilliant, weren't they, Genova? Your daughter was one of them. They were so funny and they really got into it. And initially I'd wanted them to speak at the same speed and tone as the original recordings. So you could have one in each ear. But it was much more fun to say improvise, to describe it to them and let them just go with it.
And of course, the voices are not trying to imitate the voices of the people that were on the recordings. No. They're very much sort of modern voices from now. But also they weren't sort of, in a way, sort of stereotype Cockney voices either.
No, I mean, I tell you, it's remarkably hard to find an 8-year-old Cockney.
It's interesting. I was reading about that. I was reading about the sort of literally the diminishing of Cockney.
It's really hard,
as a sort of new street language appears.
I mean, where I live in Thanet, kids sound more like Cockneys than they do in Tower Hamlets. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe they've all sort of moved to Thanet, lots of Cockneys.
Can I ask you a little bit about the responsibility of working and playing with original material? You know, do you feel that you were faithful to those recordings? Because obviously they were in context of an interview or something. And of course, you're cutting them up and editing. How do you feel that you can sort of make it still swing and sing to a modern audience, but being faithful to those original recordings?
Well, they didn't actually improvise out of what the original participants said. I let them all improvise more freely and create acting, so they could act some of the scenes sort of with physical elements. But actually, they are keeping exactly within context and almost following a script that I wrote for them.
And I suppose what I can hear is that it's something, a play on the sound, because it's quite panned. There's quite a lot of stereo going on, but also the visual element as well. It is a performance piece, isn't it?
Yeah,
really?
Yeah, I think so. And yeah, if you do go in there and there's lots of people in there, you won't really hear it very well. Because I used technology for a quiet space. I also didn't want to drive our security guard mad by listening to this piece for 8 hours a day for 3 months.
And of course, what is great about the material is that you really do get a sense of place, because obviously so many sort of street names are mentioned. And also, it's also food is important as well. You can also, you almost can smell the food.
There are some smells. I did wash all the laundry in very smelly soaps, and there's some hidden diffusers that are emitting smells of streets and things. But
As you put it together, after all the work, how did it feel just kind of experiencing what you had achieved with this piece?
Yeah, I'm really happy with this piece. And there was a lot of research from different sources. There's a local author who collects children's songs. Off the top of my head, I've completely do you remember his name?
Dan Jones.
Yes. He wrote a book called Inky Pinky Ponky, and he collected stories from local children. And all of the nursery rhymes in the piece are from that book. And so it feels like there's a sense of cohesion in that way, that all the sonic material, it all spoke to me, and I curated it, I suppose. I suppose we all curated it. Yeah. What's
also great is that, for me, listening to it, it's just a way of experimentation. It's a way you can use archive in the 21st century. So it's a great achievement, Emily. So thank you.
Alan.
Thank you very much. And we'll come back to this later on as we hear everyone else's piece. For now, thank you, Emily.
Thanks.
Alistair Levy is next, and Alistair trained in photography at the Royal College of Art, and his interdisciplinary work includes sound, film and photography. It seeks to make sense of the world by salvaging fragments relating to everyday life and material culture. Alistair's exhibited widely in galleries, both in the UK and internationally. His piece for this exhibition is entitled My Home in Morgan Street, and brings together fragments of oral history recordings from Tower Hamlets Local History Library and Archives and the Jewish Museum, London, along with new material recorded on an analogue cassette recorder and audio found online. And all of these touch on daily life experienced by Jewish and Bengali immigrants to Tower Hamlets, including racism, politics, religion, and music. And Alistair will be in conversation with me, Nadia Valman. I teach the literature of London at Queen Mary University of London, and I'm a researcher in the cultural history of the East End. And I've worked extensively with local schools, and I've also produced a number of events for the public based on my research, including walking tours, projection events, and musical parades. So, Alistair, first, can you tell me a little bit about your previous work and how this piece fits into your work?
Yeah, okay. So I think I've always, for as long as I can remember, been very interested in the everyday as a subject, and also ideas around domesticity and the home. So I think there was a kind of immediate connection with this material. And a few years ago, in 2019, I made a film about my grandfather, who grew up in Mile End. So he was of East European Jewish descent. And so that piece was almost like a stepping stone to this project for me in a way. So that was a video that I made using mixtapes that he left behind after his death. His big passion was classical music, and he left behind this box of about 50 tapes. And as well as there being music on them, there was also his voice. So they're a form of oral history. He was introducing the music basically on these tapes. So they were sort of very rich, potent objects, and kind of like a very personal archive, basically. So there was a kind of a link through that piece, I think, to this project, through sound and through the Jewish East End and all the material and the subject matter that's kind of in the archive here that we ended up working with.
So this was, in many ways, quite a personal project for you in engaging with these kinds of materials. Can you say a little bit more about its evolution as a project? What was the process and where did you begin? What did you go through in the process?
So some of the first material that I came across was the material from the Jewish Museum, and it was a collection of folk songs and music relating to Jewish culture in the East End. And there was a song called My Home in Morgan Street.
My home in Morgan Street, es ist mir wohlen geht. Ich hab mein eigen Stieb, nur schmeckt 5 stinkende Fisch. Dort steht a Mädel in a Kleidel, schreibt 6 a Penny Bagel in dem Jiedel mit sein Fiedel, spielt den Violin.
And when I came across that, I jumped a bit because my grandmother was born on Morgan Street, just about 10 minutes walk from here. And so I was very excited by the prospect of kind of using that song in the piece. And I didn't know how I wanted to use it, but I knew that I wanted it to be kind of integral to the work. And then after a few weeks, it transpired that there's 2 Morgan Streets, basically. So as well as that Morgan Street, there's another one which is now called Hessel Street. And that was a very famous street market around the turn of the century, around the beginning of the 1900s. It was a very famous Jewish street market. So I had to sort of park the idea that this song was connected to my grandmother in some way, but it still was connected to my grandmother because she grew up in the area, and it didn't really matter that there was this kind of the coincidence that I thought about the street. It wasn't the same place. So that was the starting point. And I think I went down a few different roads thinking about what material to work with. So I think at one point I was thinking that it would focus on tailoring, because of the way that tailoring sort of unites both the Jewish and the Bengali people that lived in the borough. And I looked at different subject matter, and I ended up just kind of finding there was so much interest in so many different areas. So I found it wasn't just one thing that interested me, and I wanted the final work to kind of reflect the diversity of the material, but also the diversity of life experienced by immigrants in East London. So I was just listening to everything and trying to pick out pieces, fragments that, for whatever reason, connected or resonated for me. And I sort of just had faith that they would all connect in some way at the end. I was sort of kind of shooting in the dark in a way, but then just keeping the faith that at the end, when I sort of wove it all together, it would sort of somehow, even though it was quite abstract and there isn't a linear narrative, but I was just kind of hopeful that it would mean something and it would make some kind of sense. And I feel like it does in the end, do that. So,
can you say a bit more about what you think it's saying?
Or maybe that's more difficult. So I think one thing I was very conscious of trying to do was trying to draw parallels between the experiences of the Jewish people in East London who lived here. And there's maybe this kind of slight shift in time. So maybe, very roughly speaking, the sort of end of the 19th century, first half of the 20th century, and then this Bengali migration, which was slightly later. So there's these kind of 2 movements, but I was kind of interested in the parallels between the experiences of people, and I tried to reflect that in the work. So things relating to racism, like things like, the Battle of Cable Street, which my grandfather was at, and was one of I think just 100 people were arrested on the day, and he was one of those people. And then also the murder of Altab Ali, like that you referred to earlier, which was a kind of seismic event in East London at that time. And I just wanted to try and draw parallels between these experiences and hope that would sort of say something about the universality of experience in life for people, regardless of where they're from and who they are,
And in your work, like Emily's, it isn't just a sonic element. There's also a material dimension to it. Yeah. Can you say something about why you decided to include that?
The microfilm.
The microfilm reader.
Yeah. So I think, it was kind of behind these panels here, it was kind of decommissioned and it's out of use. And I think I immediately clocked it and just thought that's a really beautiful object. And I'm really interested in things that are sort of on the brink of obsolescence. So things that are kind of just hanging on, but kind of almost falling off the cliff, but they're still, fax machines or, things that are kind of still there, but they're almost completely obsolete. And I kind of, just developed the idea of using it to show images from the print archive upstairs. So I really like the idea that we could sort of show images that connected to the sound, from these physical prints and get those put onto microfilm. And there's only one place in the UK that still makes microfilm. So it was kind of, again, it was just possible to make that happen. And I really like that, the fact that it was only just possible to kind of do it, you know. Yeah, and then there's a connection to sort of photography and lens-based media as well, I think, in how the object works and operates. So,
and also there's some of the recording of the material is actually made on cassette tape, right? It's using cassette recorders, so you're also using analog methods for your sound.
Yeah, absolutely. So as well as obviously some of the material was originally on cassette, I also recorded new material using a cassette recorder to try and sort of mimic the quality of the audio in the original recordings, just so there was a kind of, connection between the new material and the old archival material.
So this idea of objects on the brink of obsolescence is very, very intriguing and fascinating, I think. And I wanted to ask you more about the way that there's also a kind of theme of the relationship between remembering and forgetting in your piece. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so there's a bit at the beginning of the piece where a woman called Silva, who is a woman in her 90s, a Jewish woman who lives in Stanmore, and she's a Yiddish speaker. And I was interested in getting her to translate the song My Home in Morgan Street. I wanted to get the Yiddish translated into English so that I could include the English in the piece as well. But she actually had real trouble remembering the Yiddish to translate it. So we kind of, in the end, I think we got there, but it was quite, it wasn't easy to do it. But I think the whole thing around forgetting and memory is, I think it's really interesting because we're so, and I think what oral history is kind of why we're so fascinated with them is because we're so desperate to remember and have this connection to the past. And I was thinking about this morning, and it sounds really obvious, but then I'd never thought about it in exactly this way. But, you think about time as a continuum, sort of past, present and future. Like the future hasn't happened and doesn't exist, and the present is infinitesimally small. And everything is the past is everything. And I think maybe that's the reason why we're so fascinated with it, because it's all we have, And that was just something that kind of I thought of this morning when I was in the shower.
Yeah, and I think your piece, really, really has that sense of a kind of attenuated relationship to the memory of the East End, both in the subjects who speak in your piece, but also actually the process that you've described yourself, where you sort of are tempted by this, what seems to be a kind of immediate access into the memory of your family, but actually turns out not to be, and it turns out to be something a bit more fragmented. And I think, in many ways, your piece is enacting that in really interesting ways. Okay, so I hope we'll pick up some of these things a bit later. We're now moving on to our third speaker, Saima Tariq. Saima Tariq has a doctorate from the Centre for Creative Research into Sound Arts Practice, University of the Arts, London, focused on oral archival forms and processes of knowledge production connected to the 1947 partition of British India. Her wider creative audio research has developed by way of radio, music, and artistic projects in the UK, Sri Lanka, Palestine, Morocco, and Germany. Her piece for this exhibition is entitled Delay Lines and draws on several sound collections held here at the archives, including oral history interviews, life stories, public speeches, and radio broadcasts recorded in the second half of the 20th century, alongside binaural field recordings gathered around the East End during the spring and summer of 2023. It evokes connections and disruptions among and between complex political, anti-racist, housing and migration narratives that are still felt in Tower Hamlets. And Saima will be in conversation with Dr. Rehana Ahmed, who is reader in post-colonial and contemporary literature at Queen Mary University of London. She has published a book and articles on literary representations of Muslims in Britain and is currently researching ideas about solidarity, community, and protest in British Asian writing.
Thank you, Nadia, and thank you for asking me to be part of this, which is great. I found all three installations fascinating, but Saima's in particular speaks to my own interests. So it was a real pleasure to be able to spend time with it and also to be able to talk to you about it now. I wanted to start by asking you about ideas of history and time in delay lines. So one of the most striking aspects of delay lines for me is a layering of different times and different voices from those times. And these voices are from different East London communities, so Bengali, Jewish and Somali. And in this sense, your installation reflects the kind of layering you might find in an archive. Different voices from different points in history that offer a range of stories and perspectives. So I wondered if you could say something about this aspect of delay lines, its historical depth, but also its non-linear approach to history.
Thank you, Rehana, and everyone for being here and for having me. Yeah, I'm kind of obsessed with thinking about time from many different perspectives, and from my PhD on partition, which is very much time-stamped in a way, and as well as cutting through massive colony to demarcate progress and independent nation states on either side of the line, it was also a time event, right? So we can place it, I mean, as Pakistanis and Indians and Bangladeshis who know, 14th of August, midnight, 1947, the world changed, right? So I'm kind of obsessed with the idea of how we mark time, but also how, in terms of colonial historiography, how time is standardized, how time is colonized as well, and what time is deemed to be good time or bad time. So these are very broad, kind of interesting questions that maybe you could do with another PhD. But in terms of my non-linear approach to the 4 tracks that I made for Delay Lines, I was very much driven by the idea that when we are working with the archive, so all 3 of us have worked with the collections here and have spent a lot of time here and upstairs, not just listening to audio, but looking through photographs, reading books. I was reading newspaper clippings from various, box files on racism, anti-racism, women's health, poetry, the anti-fascist and also anti-racist resistance against the National Front in 1978 as some examples. But then how do you conceive of lost time? And how can we conceive of the archive as not separate from that lost or past time, but very much part of it? And so that was something that my PhD was very interested in. Of course, it was about partition, and of course it was about sound, because partition was so, the history is so dependent on oral history and sonic legacies, because the written evidence was burnt and destroyed and lost or censored, in this country censored. So this idea of what do you do with sound when you don't have any other evidence? And what can the archive do in terms of that temporal state? So I think in that way, I didn't want to kind of go chronologically. Obviously, I think none of us did. But this idea of disrupting time and the temporal from this kind of maybe not decolonial, but maybe anti-colonial perspective of, does it matter if we're listening to things in sequence? Does it matter if we're listening to things that somehow are 40 years apart? And that's why I wanted to do contemporary field recordings as well. And luckily, there were so many things happening in East London, and that was a way to evidence my own labour with this time as well.
Coaches came along, and a lot of them started giving the Hitler salutes and shouting, "Jew bastards" and all that, and
the police.
from the police and
from
the police vans.
The police were shouting.
Yeah, well, we took them to be police anyway.
Thank you. Just sort of staying with the idea of time for a moment, could you say something about the image of the clock seller at Brick Lane Sunday Markets from 1970? Because that's, that accompanies your installation and it's very kind of dominant and you're listening. And I wondered if that might relate to your treatment of time in the sound installation.
Yeah, I originally didn't want to include any images. I mean, I did print a zine, and Sanjida Alam, who works at the archive, has been so good at reprinting them constantly because it seems that people have just been taking them. And I think it was really nice of the archive to let me have this thing where, like, okay, you can have a free publication also after listening to this stuff as a resource. But with The Clock Seller, which is a photograph by Ron McCormick that was taken in 1970 at Brick Lane Sunday Market, but it's also categorized differently in the archive. Like sometimes it's Brick Lane Sunday Market, sometimes it's Sclater Street. And my historical geography is not good enough to know if is that the same thing? Did they change it? But anyway, I came across there's a series of publications that are also on sale for upstairs, actually, by Café Royale publishers. They're mainly photography based, as far as I understand it. And I was looking through one of them upstairs on a Wednesday afternoon, And I came across this image very badly reprinted, and it's like they're like this size, like a zine size. And I was just really struck by the photograph. Considering my obsession with time, my interest in disrupting archival time or colonial time or sort of event time, in the sense that sound can be very disruptive, in the sense where we can, revealing the work of time through sound is something that I'm very interested in. And I think it's something that's very effective. So I didn't want to include a photograph, but when I saw this man standing there on the street with many clocks around him, and they all have slightly different times on them, and it was frozen, and so there's a historian called Ariela Aisha Azile who talks about the archive as kind of shutting down time as shutters, as a camera shutter, and how a photograph can freeze time in a way that forecloses both the past and the future, right? So this idea that I could also, in this 2-dimensional image of this guy, beautiful photograph from 1970, that revealing all these different times at the same time, yes. I was like, okay, it has to be in it. And then Tamsin, the heritage manager here, said, I think he's still alive. He's living in Wales. Let's get in touch with him because we don't have the original print in the archive. And so I was coming in for days looking for the original print. And the archive here has many photographs of his. He was pretty much like a prolific East London photographer. And it's like incredible. He's photographed incredible moments here. But that photograph wasn't in it. And I'm like, no, there's no time. There's no time to get this photograph of time. And she was like, no, I'll put you in touch with him. And he's in his studio in Wales. Like, yeah, no problem. And he got out his original print in his studio. He treated it for me. He was dealing with our printing studio that we were all using here in Bethnal Green. Stuff like, I can't talk about photography. Maybe Alistair could, but I had no idea what he was talking about color correction, about this and that and the other. And so I think the archive have now bought the original print from him because of this encounter with it. So I think that's amazing. So now it is upstairs. But yeah, the idea of having this kind of multiple times at one time was very much speaking to what it also gives people something to look at. If they don't feel like listening to all this heavy stuff or reading the banners, they can just sit on a sofa and look at it. So yeah, that was the idea behind it.
I want to ask you about silence and listening next. So there are lots of different voices in your installation, but there are also silences. That, for example, there's a minute silence to mark the anniversary of Altab Ali's murder. And there's also an emphasis on listening. So it opens with Caroline Adams listening to her interviewees. And also there's various other fragments of interviews kind of throughout. And then there's also the kind of near silent role of the interviewer who's listening. And then there's our position as listener to your piece. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the importance of silence and listening in your work.
That's a really big question. But I think when it comes to listening first, maybe, I was really drawn to the idea of, and this has also come from my PhD research as well, but this idea of listening with rather than listening to, and what those distinctions can mean politically, sonically, artistically. But the idea that we have all been given free rein over these really important and rich historical collections of sound and of voices from the past, and we can do what we want with them. I think this idea of listening with is, for me, is kind of a way of transparency. So to allow people to understand that I'm also listening to this stuff and that I don't have a kind of authority over this material, or I don't necessarily, the way I've edited together, the way I've, for example, Caroline Adams is listening, for me was very interesting because she records the death of John Lennon on the radio, and then it cuts, and then she's like talking to a Bangladeshi about their trip on a ship here in the 1940s or whatever it might be. And she's kind of revealing people's listening tells you a lot about sound, actually. It tells you a lot about what's being said because they're also being guided to speak, they're not speaking in a vacuum. Caroline Adams was very much guiding the conversations and deciding the topics in which they were talking about. So I wanted to highlight that in that track. But listening in general, like this idea of listening with, also connecting to the theme of solidarity across time and space. It's a difficult one, and I don't know if I've squared it yet with myself, but it's, for me, it's an ethical position. So recording the minute silence there and it not being necessarily silent, maybe, or including slightly problematic voices or speeches in the tracks as well that are being listened to on a BBC broadcast, and we're listening to people listening. For me, I like this kind of meta listening where we're constantly aware of our position.
Yes.
So I think that's what led me to include these certain clips, which is like not just content, but it's like people listening to certain content. Yeah.
Yeah, so great. So I also wanted to ask you about if there's this kind of sense of progression through the 4 sections of your installation. So it starts with an emphasis on listening, Caroline Adams listening, to interviewees whose voices are barely audible. And it ends with a woman speaking at length in Somali. There seems to me in it to be a kind of trajectory towards speech, so towards immigrants' voices being heard, making themselves heard. So I wondered if there is a sense of progression, or is there rather a sense of nothing having really changed very much, as the title of this exhibition might suggest, everything is different, nothing has changed. I wondered if you could say something about that.
The progression, I wrote this kind of cheesy, let's call it a poem or haiku or something, that ended up being the 4 titles, right? So, have you heard? All countries are bordered, the city is ours, but home takes time. And I wrote it in that way as, yes, these were going to be track titles with very broad themes, nationalism, you're going from country to city to home, and time, and, there's a little cheeky akab in there as well. So, there's a lot of big themes in there, but in terms of the progression, I didn't really know how I wasn't really sure about how people would listen to this. And because this is a library and an archive, my intention was to make it accessible, comfortable. People can sit down, people can listen if they want to, people can read if they want to, people can do nothing if they want to. And there's no sort of instruction. So it's interesting to hear you say that you found there a progression from Caroline Adams listening to this kind of outburst of Somali speech, which I chose intentionally not to translate. So the Somali and Bengali women who speak, they were extra collections that were not part of this original project, but I found the collections that we did have access to so male-centric, and there weren't women's voices in there. And so many of the women's voices in this archive are actually in other languages. And so what's the problem with including other languages, And do we have to pander to the Anglophonic listener always? And why not write it in Bengali script? My Somali friend sort of transliterated it in Roman English, because I think the Somali script and the printing became a problem with that as well. And Sanjida noticed that there was some symbols in Bengali that didn't come through on Photoshop. Or I don't know, there was all these issues around translation, and there was so much labor in the translation in this work, more than even the editing, because I was having to read and listen, and then there was a lot of back and forth. So I think this idea of including voices, yes, that would they're not silenced by the archive because they're in the archive. It's just a way of promoting maybe the idea that we don't need to just listen to our own languages and our own people. And hopefully maybe if a Bengali or Somali person comes and listens to this, they will get something out of it that I could never, and that doesn't matter because I don't have authority on this history, they do. So I'm sorry, I probably didn't answer your question.
No, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
So now I'd like to invite you to ask questions or to contribute your thoughts on the very, very rich presentations and conversations that we've heard tonight.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you so much. That was so inspiring and really, really interesting to listen to. I have a question perhaps for all 3 of you, but maybe more specifically to Emily. Is it Emily? And Alistair, but also to Saima. I'm curious about the importance of music or song in your pieces. Specifically, is it that music is perhaps a tool to trigger memory, or is it really more about the telling of a time? Maybe you could talk a bit about the importance of music or song in your pieces.
Well, it's initially transporting you back. I love the idea. Well, I think children's playground songs instantly transport us back, and I think we remember them all of our lives, actually. So that element is about transporting you back in time, but also it's a conceptual thing for me. And the songs always have to be, when I use them, and I often do, especially children's songs, they have to be local. They have to exist in the area that the piece is about. So it's almost like they have to be site-specific. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think the Yiddish folk song that I used, one of the things I loved about it is the images that it conjures. So I think that through the lyrics, through the words, it's not just the music. I think the musicality is really important. And I think I listened to quite a lot of folk songs, but this one in particular had a musicality that I really liked, but it also described images of, a bagel seller or, a man playing the violin. And I think that sort of transported me back 100 years to that street at that moment. And I love that sort of, it's very simple in a way, but I love the way that I guess folk songs can do, or it's a street song, isn't it? I guess, yeah, street songs would do that. And then I also recorded a singer called Ala Rahman singing the song about Altab Ali's murder, which is something that he'd sung, I think, quite a long time ago, but he re-recorded it for me so that I was very conscious I wanted to include song from both sides, from both the Jewish and the Bengali. Yeah, so there was kind of balance in the piece and they reflected both. So, yeah.
I'd just like to add the other thing about song is that, apart from evoking memory and having the power to kind of really conjure up a meaning, but it's also, for a listener, it really helps when you're hearing a piece that you've not heard for the first time. And it helps as a sort of bridge between the voices as well. There's something about the way, as a sound artist, you kind of link voice with music. I think that is very much also part of your skill as well. And I think that is also, it can work very, very powerfully in this case.
It kind of punctuate different scenes almost.
Yeah.
As well. Yeah.
Yeah, I've done previous work where I did include, sort of music and poetry. With this, the only thing I can think of that answers your question or could go to answering your question is I did, in the All Countries Are Bordered track, there is a recording of an eviction. So it was an illegal eviction that happened in Shadwell in March 2023 of a homeless shelter by police. And in that homeless shelter, there were people who had been previously displaced from council flat that had been burnt down in a fire that was run by a slum lord known to Tower Hamlets Council. And there is currently a court case. Anyway, at this eviction, there was a lot of noise and music, but there was this guy who was very cheerily singing and playing Bella Ciao on his acoustic guitar, which I couldn't not include. And I even included the first two lines of Bella Ciao on the text banners, which were very selective and partial, I guess, I don't know what they are, indexes maybe of what you hear in the audio. And it was really crazy because there was so much contestation going on and so much sort of confusion going on. And there was this guy cheerily on his guitar singing this Italian protest song. If people don't know, it has become a universal anthem for change, and for anti-authoritarian change, I would say. So, and that's the only time I used music in it. And that recording, actually my raw file of that eviction is probably about an hour long or more. We stood there for about an hour. And I think my choice to use that clip was really because of this guy and his guitar. So, yeah, I don't know if that means anything or not. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you very much. I have a question for Saima, actually. One of the things that really struck me listening to the archives and the material was that what a sense of collaboration was happening between different ethnic groups when faced with the adversity of dealing with the fascists in the area. And I think I want to make a parallel to what's happening with the Gaza protest movement that's happening in London in a weekly way. I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit. And as an Iranian, actually, I'm really sad to see that the Iranian opposition has chosen to stay out of the protests because of what they see as the Iranian government support for Hamas. And they think if they back up this protest is a betrayal of what was happening in their own local context. And what really stood out in experiencing the installation was that different ethnic groups realized that they were natural allies in the region, and they came together to mobilize and to organize local resistance, either in form of vigilante groups or protests. And I feel like the same thing is happening now. Could you speak to that, if this is a tradition that's exclusive to East London, or this is a London tradition, and how that has carried over to what we're seeing today? Thank you very much.
That's a lot. I can't speak about, I'm not from East London. Although I went to Queen Mary University, I lived in Whitechapel. When I was at university, I also lived on the border of Tower Hamlets when me and you met, when I was in Broadway Market. So I've got this connection to East London that I think speaks to my interest in these solidarities across time and space between different communities. I think in terms of your question of like, if this is, unique to the area or if this is a London thing, I can't say. I know for me, like working with sound and speech, so not necessarily music or field recordings of nature or birds or the city or whatever it might be, but really focusing the last 6 years of my life on people's voices and people's voices without their image gives you a completely different sense of what people do care about and what they feel beyond their identity. And I think stripping out of the visual, I think Emily spoke a little bit earlier about, why she's working with sound and why, there is a visual hierarchy in our society, in our world, and like the sense of sight is given predominance over the sense of hearing. And so when you strip that away and you're hearing to people from, I don't know, I think I was listening to voices from at least 6 different ethnic communities. And even then, what is an ethnic community, because you're listening to Siletis from Bangladesh and they have nothing, to maybe do with, if in rural Sylhet, with cosmopolitan Bengali speakers who are migrants in another part of London, So that's a roundabout way to say I don't know, but also I find it very interesting and kind of flattering that you said that. It is crazy what's happening in London right now and what's happening in Gaza right now. And there is a completely multidimensional, intersectional, radical movement in this city against what is happening and against what our government is refusing to see. And I do see that maybe as a tradition of this city, although maybe I'm not old enough to know it. But for me, it feels completely natural and good. So that's how I can answer your question. Thank you.
Could I add something to that? Is that all right? Have you got a second? Can I add the point to that? I think that as we are in East London, I think it's quite important to stress and focus on East London here. And East London does have a very, very vital and powerful tradition of solidarity against racism and fascism. And we saw that in the Battle of Cable Street. It wasn't just Jewish people that came out against fascism. It was Irish. It was people from all different backgrounds who fought it. And the same with the battle against the National Front in the 70s. So many people came out. And I think that is very important. And I think that what is specific about East London is the fact that East London has always been perceived by the other as being cosmopolitan. And it was always perceived as cosmopolitan for a long time. And people were sort of proudly cosmopolitan to a certain extent. And that cosmopolitan element is perceived by others maybe as something difficult or unsavoury. And so East Londoners, I feel, have come together in solidarity against those who are in opposition to cosmopolitanism. It's very simplistic in a sense, but it's very important, very true. And it's also how people arrived in East London. People came from everywhere. East London is made up of everywhere, whether they came from Bangladesh or Somalia or Eastern Europe or Ireland or East Anglia. The people came from so many different places. So I think, and they knowingly came from those places and lived side by side. And also key is that people helped and fought with each other. So I think solidarity is very important. And I'm sure other parts of London would echo that, but I think East London is particularly special, and the docks are so linked with that, because that's how so many people arrived.
It's actually, I didn't say that, but it's actually the river. It's the proximity to the Thames and the dockyards that makes also this archive really crazy. Like, it's so rich.
Yeah. And East Londoners were outsiders. They were outside the city. They weren't perceived as being sort of, there was always that as well. There was something. Would you agree with that, Nadia?
Yes, I would agree with that. Yes, absolutely.
It's good to get.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's also important not to over-romanticize that East End past, because I think it's true that Cable Street was the proudest moment in East End history, but I think there's plenty of moments that weren't as happy and weren't as harmonious. And I think we just need to have some skepticism about, or some, temper that romanticism so that it doesn't fall into a kind of nostalgia that really papers over the difficulties, the struggles that continued through all of that time, Indeed. All of those times. There's another question here at the front. Thank you.
Thank you all. That was really interesting. I had a question which is slightly random, but it's based, Saima, on my listening to one of the tracks on your installation, where the person asking questions of the residents in East London, from her accent and her voice and her tone, sounds quite like a hegemonic kind of subject. And the way she framed some of the questions are they made me feel very uncomfortable. And I wondered, I'd be curious if anyone of the other contributors to the exhibition also had any thoughts on that. But I wondered if you could talk a bit about the challenges of that, and if that geared you towards looking at other voices that you included in your work, and just wonder about the kind of British objectivity and investment in documentary and audio, which is part of a colonial project, right? And this feeling I have of that person who was asking, and how much that is present, that you guys found that present in the archive, because there's a love here of a kind of sociological thing in studying subjects and understanding the subjects in the city that feels really violent to me. And I wondered how you felt about that, if you felt that you were undoing that, how you dealt with that, if there's a listening against the grain in a way, the way that we talk about reading history against the grain. If you could just talk to that. And I'm curious if any of you if you felt that too in hearing it. Just really struck me that I felt really enraged by the way that she spoke to people, and how I felt she thought she knew their trials and tribulations in terms of their countries of origin.
I think that's really important point. And obviously we all listen differently. And even if you have a PhD in sound studies, you cannot pretend that your listening is not subjective, and that our listening to each other is not intersubjective and then highly, highly partial and unevidenceable or something, And so when we try and make sound studies or sound art into some academic, disciplinary, scientific almost thing, it means listening to stuff that we don't like. So in a way, with my partition research, I had to listen to a lot of stuff I didn't want to listen to. And maybe this comes back to the question that Rehana asked me, where I was speaking about listening with. And it's also something that Nadia brought up. So in one of the tracks, there's a philanthropist, Jewish woman, who's speaking about homes for the white slave trade and sex workers, and in a way, I know that Nadia found that quite problematic to listen to as well. And for me, maybe I didn't hear that, I knew that she sounded like a posh woman, just like Caroline Adams sounds like quite patronizing. And this is something that Alistair, me and you were talking a lot about, how it was weird because all her interviews of Caroline Adams, the book is an incredible resource of a specific migrant group who came here at a specific time. But it seems like the tape recorder was always pointed towards herself, because her interviewees, the sound is absolutely terrible. And without the transcripts and the notes, you couldn't really understand them. And in a way, my centering of her listening and her voice is also determined by the material conditions in which we are working with these recordings, which is she is very clear in it, So what does that mean, And I think that was a way for me to highlight, that track was actually inspired by something I did for my PhD work, where I was listening to colonial sort of interviews with people who were in British India at the time, but they were colonial servants. So they were administrators or soldiers' wives, and Bristol archives have this huge collection of oral histories with white people who are in India. And we're not allowed to make them sound racist. So I was like, okay, I'll censor them. I'll just delete their voices and leave in the oral historian's voice. And then what does that do? So this is a way, I think centering listening or listening with, obviously people hear things differently and I don't want to upset anybody, but I do think it's important to listen to hegemony as well. in a way, but then as artists, we can creatively reframe that and hopefully take people with us on our own discomfort about it as well.
Take slightly different. I mean, I did feel really cross with her because I thought she'd put the mic in another room and put a coat on it and pointed it towards herself as well. But I was really cross with her because of the quality of the recording, but also it was for her own notes, wasn't it? But I also am not interested in what she had to say. I wanted to listen to what the other people were saying. And I thought it was really interesting that you used the questions. I thought that was really clever and interesting. I didn't use her archive, and I am sad about that. I just couldn't I was interested in what they were saying. It was so hard to hear the voices, and I didn't want to recreate them. It just didn't feel right. But the way that I look at it is slightly different, and it was the intent. So she had the intention to capture and save, in a way, stories, really important stories that might have been forgotten. And I find that really interesting that she did that. And she wanted to keep them forever so other people could listen and learn about them. And so I sort of see it from that way. But, that's not saying what she did. She was patronising.
I mean, she wasn't even an oral historian. She was a community social worker.
She was, yes. But why did she decide to collect them? Was she colonising their stories?
I wouldn't say, I wouldn't go that
harsh,
far.
Yeah,
but I do understand the question of, I mean, it's very frustrating, and I know this from listening to recordings for my PhD, about you're listening and listening and listening, and you want them to get to the story, and then there's some patronizing question about religion, or, do you hate Hindus, or, whatever it might be.
Yeah. It's so hard to interview and know how to ask questions in a way that gives them space to give you interesting answers, and it can take a really long time, can't it, to get there? And it did remind me of the folk song collectors in England in the 1920s, and they went around all these suburban communities recording songs, which they then put in books and censored in schools so children could sing them. They wanted to capture and save and collect all the oral history that was sung in suburban England, which I thought was fascinating. But it's almost like the approach was a bit like that. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with the question. I mean, and the spirit of the question, I think it was very problematic for me as well. And I think actually Simon is really the only one of us who used significant amount of content. I used a very small kind of piece that was peripheral to the main interviews because I just wanted to have her voice in the piece, just because that was important to me. But I agree that I did also find it very problematic. And I think the power imbalance operates on a couple of different levels, because there's the sort of obvious one, but then there's also the power imbalance of, I'm thinking about one of the hats I wear is I'm a photographer and I do a lot of portrait photography. And I'm thinking about the power imbalance when you point a camera at someone or you point a microphone at someone, there's immediately a sort of discomfort or power imbalance. I know that when I do these portrait jobs that there's a control element, or kind of, you're the authority in the sense, and you're directing someone. And I think the power imbalance operates on quite a few different levels. But I agree with the sort of your initial question about I think there are serious issues with the approach, and I think. And also, just as you were saying, the fact that you can't hear it meant that we couldn't, and
the notes were amazing, and there were some brilliant stories that I would have loved to have put in the piece that would have fit so well, but they were so poorly recorded. They weren't.
It's a good example that of nonetheless Simon was able to work with that in a way that did, I think, really make these points, make tangible what your response was.
Yeah, briefly, I just want to say it's great that you've had access to that material, which otherwise would just not exist. And we take microphones for granted now. They're so synonymous with our lives. Every single person around here has a microphone. We're carrying a microphone in our phone. Years ago, we just weren't. Very, very few people knew how to use a microphone. Cameras had been around for a long, long time. The average person didn't actually have a microphone to actually wield to talk to people way, way later than photography. So it's still in defense of the ineptness of some of the recordings. It's basically down to the fact that the technique hadn't been there. I think one of the things now, where particularly people are doing oral history and learning oral history and studying oral history, is that they are taught microphone technique. And I think that is important, because microphone technique doesn't allow that sort of scenario to happen anymore, when both people are heard clearly, and it democratizes the voice. And that's what oral history was all about. It was about democratizing the voice. As Studs Terkel said, who built the pyramids? Everyone says the pharaohs. We know the pharaohs never built the pyramids. We know the people built the pyramids. But the key thing is that it is about, oral history came in as a sort of grassroots movement, and people were trying to grasp it in any which way. So I think in respect to Caroline Adams' material, it was the foresight of actually speaking to those people who were otherwise would have been totally ignored. It would have slipped through the cracks of history.
Yeah. We have time for one more question, if there is one. Go ahead.
It's just in reference to your point about solidarity in the East End. And I just wondered, is that solidarity, were people united through class or was it ethnicity? Obviously it wasn't, because they were very diverse groups. But if I think about it now, it's very diverse, but is it assimilated? I don't think it is. Has it ever been? And I guess, what were the points that people were united on? Was it this mutual fight against fascism, or was it the working class coming together? Has there ever been a point where the crossovers between communities, like Bengali communities and Jewish communities, did they ever come together socially, collectively? These are kind of curiosities that I have about the area.
They're really big questions. How long have we got?
Sorry.
No, did you want to start with that? I think
I would say, for example, trades unionism in the late 19th century and the early 20th century was something that brought people together across communities. Sometimes those trades unions were ethnically separate, but they were fighting for the same cause. And sometimes, quite often they were actually people working together within those unions. So that was an example of class, for sure, being the thing that united people, and the goals of improving their working conditions and their wages were the things that brought them together. That was one of them.
Definitely. I think class is a spine throughout, I think, from experience, from people's experiences. I think, obviously, a battle against injustice, what people feel is unjust, whether racism is unjust, whether being treated badly at work is unjust, whether being prevented from living in a place in harmony is unjust. But all of these things, I think, are part of the story. And it is such a complicated one because, as Nadia was saying earlier, it's not just about people all coming together. Obviously, within East London, there were pockets where people were prejudiced against others. So, for example, there was this famous story that comes out in so many interviews that I've done, particularly with Jewish people in Bangladeshi community, both in the interwar years and in the 70s, is about just crossing Bethnal Green Road. So, and Brick Lane, that kind of, the idea of literally just space, and if you move into another space, you are confronted by particular values that are alien or against yours. And I think that existed in East London. East London was in some ways a collection of villages, and it still is in a way. I think the boundaries are blurred a little bit more now. So East London is not just one unit. It's a complex set of villages where some people within that lived in what you could call ghettos. But I don't really like that word, but they were in some form or another. So people felt safe in those spaces, and you sometimes, if you sort of meandered away from them as an outside, that you can be confronted by the sense of the other. But it's for another conversation.
I would like to add very, very quickly to that, though, that I think contention against policing and for housing rights, for me, from everything that I've listened to, not only from the collections in the archive that are about the political movements or Cable Street or the National Front or whatever it might be, but even just in the women's stories talking about their lives and homes, and that it's always penetrated with fear of either police or somebody attacking or harming somebody in their family, in or close to their home. I don't know if that adds to Alan's answer, but for me, policing and housing is everything. It's everything in this part of London. From what I understand, in the very short time that we were given to do this exhibition, this is what I kept hearing again and again and again in all of the collections. So...
Okay, thank you very much to everybody who's come. I would like to just end by picking up something Simon said before, which is about how we all listen differently. And the real virtue of sound art is that it doesn't tell you how to hear. It doesn't tell you how to listen. It's really for every single person to listen and hear what they hear. So I would highly encourage you, if you haven't already listened to all of the work, next door. Please come in the last week of its opening. And finally, I'd like to thank Sanjida, Genova and Tamsin from the archive, to Katie from Queen Mary, and our panelists, Alan Dein and Rehana Ahmed, and most of all, our artists, Alistair Levy, Emily Peasgood and Saima Tariq. Thank you very much, and thank you to the audience.